Hello everyone, this is your instructor, Dr. Michael Shepard, and I'm here with a introductory lecture for you. We're going to try and cover a lot of ground and both mix in some general overview information along with some specifics to get us started in the beginning of our term. So this lecture is going to be on language preservation, diversity, and tying in what is cultural work and what does the field of cultural sustainability have to say or mean for this topic. So I'm going to start out with what is a language community? We're going to talk a lot about language communities, language endangerment, language preservation, language revitalization. But first we have to kind of step back to the beginning and make sure that we're on the same page about what that community is. Many of you are going to be coming from your own diverse language communities, and we all participate in one or more of those type of communities. Now, a language community can be as specific as being part of a cultural community where, such as American Sign Language. American Sign Language has its own unique cultural practices and processes of cohesion that bring people together in community. A language community could also be something that is quite selective and may only represent a portion of what is important in the rest of your life. So I've got an example of a Trekkie up here who is teaching a class on Klingon. Klingon is essentially a made-up language from TV, from the Star Trek series, but it has a following, it has people who speak it, it has people who study it, it has people who describe and write it and add to it. Is it a language that we are going to be focusing on in this class? No, not really. But there are those people who would consider themselves having a community around that language. They care about it, they're interested in seeing its continuity, and it's a process of cultural participation for them. Here's just another shot of people speaking in a language and forming community around that. So if you get back to your intro level Anthropology 101 kind of definitions for culture and language, culture is a society's shared and socially transmitted ideas, values, and perceptions. And that's quite pertinent for language, which we know is a system of communication. It uses a variety of mechanisms that are either very abstract or very tangible to communicate and describe the world around us. And that's done by having rules for how language operates. It's done with symbols, gestures, and marks, and it is a system that is intelligible to those who share in that language. So a language community can be many things, and you may participate in one or more of these language communities. And what's important is to think about the processes of how those cultural values, those cultural qualities are shared, how they're transmitted, and what they say about the larger culture that is making use of that language. Now, language, we're going to be looking at a lot in the context of concepts such as language shift, language documentation, and language revitalization. Those are our three major themes of the course. And we're going to continue to run up against, there are a diverse number of reasons for why language shift occurs. Now again, language shift can either be intentional or unintentional. If you look at Old English, Old English is a language that is almost completely unintelligible compared to modern English. But at one time, anybody who spoke English, that is what they spoke. Today, we don't really speak Old English, and almost no one does, but there are also very few people who mourn the loss of it or hope to return to use of that language. It's because the shift was unintentional. It happened gradually over time, and it generally did not involve a forcible movement or what could be described as a coercive movement away from one language to another. So that language shift process happens all the time. But what we see with many other languages is that their shift is a product of forced, prescriptive changes, such as acculturation, such as cultural erasure or assimilation. And when we think about those processes, we're going to run up into the idea of colonization over and over again. And it's important to remember that colonization is primarily a process that is interested in land acquisition. So it's a process of land acquisition. But it's also about cultural change and cultural acquisition as well, or at least cultural shift. In North America, boarding schools were a particular kind of forceful aspect of that process of shift, and something that we will see in other places as well. And I think on a larger level, there's a global interest in revitalization. It's not always successful. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But what is key is that revitalization, if it's going to occur, relies on and is dependent on language documentation and work being done within communities to highlight and to identify the reasons and create planning for why that revitalization should happen and how it can be achieved. And finally, language revitalization is part of cultural sustainability. Now, here's some of the what we know as the bad news. Language endangerment is happening at a scale that is almost difficult for us to imagine. And it's because of a number of factors. Some are just pure numbers. 10% of the global population speaks the vast majority of the world's languages. And that means that there are many, many small micro languages that are spoken by relatively tiny communities, language communities. That makes them more vulnerable just because of their sheer numbers. The predictions are that within the next 80 years, we can see up to 90% of the world's languages go dormant. So that's taking almost all of those languages that are not the most dominant ones spoken by the vast minority of the population. And each continent is different, but and each country has different a different story to tell about language, but in the US, 80% of those native languages are no longer learned by children. In the US, there is a particularly dramatic amount of shift that has occurred. And as language endangerment increases, their value and interest of those processes and those products of language documentation can dramatically increase. And here, just to give a graphic here, that doesn't really help much. We can see in the US pre-contact kind of major languages, and as contact spread, we can see the changes in that amount of language diversity. So you can see that backing up to 1850 is really not that long ago, but when we get to 1890, again not that long ago, we really see some dramatic changes. And then today, what is considered those viable languages really relate to, in most cases, the larger land-holding tribes have some of the more viable or intact languages today. So fairly dramatic. Here's some other ways to look at that information. So we can think about language diversity on a global scale. If we're thinking about continents and countries that have great amounts of language diversity, and how that would be reflected on a global map. Instead of seeing geographic scale, we're seeing language diversity scale. So we've got places like Papua New Guinea is huge for its normal geographic size. Nigeria, huge for its geographic size. India, a huge country already, but also having a huge footprint for language diversity. Again, here for in Mexico, Guatemala, some surprising countries pop up here when we see that diversity. And if we were to zoom in just for a couple examples, here is a Alaskan example for some of the diversity of different language communities, both in terms of language families, and then when we drill down to all of these smaller individual languages within the families. Here again, another example, Papua New Guinea, showing the diversity of major language families here. But then when we drill down into a particular province, so this is one little province here of Papua New Guinea, we get just a vast array of different languages. So the concentration and the diversity is really quite astounding in many places of the world. And when we look at all that diversity, and we look at some of those numbers showing the dramatic rates of shift, it brings up some questions about preservation. What kind of rationale do we have for preservation? Why does this make sense to try and achieve? I'm going to talk about it I've got 6 different subheadings here that we'll run through. And the first is cultural sustainability. We're in a cultural sustainability program, and it's important that we connect to elements of what is valuable for this discipline. So as we've seen, language is part of that cultural framework. Language is one of the most defining and salient aspects of cultural identity. When you see someone, you can't always tell what culture they're from. When you hear them speak, it's a clear indicator of a cultural trait. It's one of those cultural indicators that we as humans latch onto very dramatically, very quickly. Human language communicates cultural history and present. Human language communicates values and ideology. And for me, being an anthropologist, anytime we see one of those salient aspects of human culture, we know that the study of that aspect of human culture, whether we're studying its processes of change, its use, its history, its future, we know that is a lens to view larger cultural processes through, to understand culture as a whole. And continuity of cultural traditions and their study is one of those tenets of the field of cultural sustainability. Another direction of rationale for considering approaches to preservation for language involves cultural sustainability, cultural sovereignty. Sovereignty is a unique term. It kind of stems from processes when there was in feudal Europe, when there were sovereigns that had ultimate authority over land and people. Now, when tribes use that same word, sovereignty, it doesn't necessarily mean ultimate control and authority, but it does mean the capacity to govern one's own nation or community, both in the present and looking into the future. So for tribes, particularly in the US, where we have very clear treaty law and we have very clear expectations for what treaty rights mean, we really have a situation where tribes understand themselves to be nations within a larger nation. And so they view their sovereignty as an expression of their treaty rights, their cultural past, and that sovereignty allows them to identify how they want to exist today and in the future. And that term is closely associated with the concept of self-determination. And that's really the capacity of a people to determine their own future and political or cultural status. So sovereignty is more of a concept that relates to a government-to-government relationship, a legal and political determination. And self-determination is really how that is enacted on the ground and that ability for people to make those decisions. So for cultural sovereignty, that loss of language has a variety of impacts. There can be the simple impact that in many places the loss of language was not a selected process. It was forced and without a lot of ability to choose otherwise. It can disrupt processes of cultural self-determination. That impact is seen as exponential for these small and poor communities, and that makes it even more challenging to really own and try and achieve cultural sovereignty. And these language loss is certainly seen within a larger lens of globalization, colonization, racism, and economic injustice. Another term that has some application here is alterity. Alterity kind of combines and is aligned with the idea of cultural sovereignty. And alterity is that state of having cultural otherness or difference. And when we think about how cultural groups they communicate and they express their cultural sovereignty, part of that is in maintaining cultural difference. And so there's a number of scholars who have worked on this concept, and it's something that we see played out in real time in tribal communities. Cultural sovereignty also relates to political power, representation, particularly for Native communities. Your ability to demonstrate your alterity, your cultural difference, your uniqueness for tribal communities has direct implications for access to land, resources, jobs, healthcare, and housing. In the U.S., being Native American is dependent on your cultural status. It's also dependent on your blood quantum, but the two can often be quite intermixed in terms of the way they're defined. And being Native American and being able to demonstrate your alterity provides you access to these unique and culturally dependent resources or items here. And what makes this, I think, interesting is that in the US we see Congress has unilateral authority to abrogate, which means alter or change, abrogate, which means to cancel or alter treaties. So you can see a couple examples here. So this is from a South American example of a tribe advocating for their rights to determine how their land is used and to prevent a dam from being constructed on their traditional territory. They've chosen not to show up to this assembly government meeting, not in suits and ties, which is the traditional, or not the traditional, the typical dress, but they've chosen to show up in full regalia. There's a cultural meaning in there that they're communicating, not just in who they are, but how they live and how they maintain alterity through their own cultural practices. So if we see it done through dress, it's also going to be done and potentially more powerful if it's done through language. There's an example from close to my home here with the Lummi Nation, a tribe that has been instrumental in blocking major coal fossil fuel export facilities in the Puget Sound and Salish Sea. And when they are in public advocating for their rights and their treaty rights, it's often through utilization of symbolic, culturally meaningful elements as well. So you can see elements of traditional dress, and at events like this there will certainly be utilization of native language. And if you wonder what makes that important, what makes that useful, we can see that there is basis in the direct codification of how law is written. And so for a long time, until just recently in 2007, if somebody was filling out the census, they would, if they wanted to check Native American or Alaska Native, it would say, they would read that it's a person having origins of the original peoples of North America and who maintains cultural identification through community recognition or affiliation. So that maintaining of cultural identification is really quite interesting. That's to see that represented here shows that it's not enough just to be part of a tribal community, you also need to reflect those cultural those cultural practices to some degree. And if that sounds a little bit abstract, it may be, but in 1993, then real estate financier and mogul Donald Trump was testifying against a Connecticut tribe for opening the Foxwoods Casino. And he was speaking at the House Native American Affairs Committee hearing. And in describing rationale for his objection to that casino, he said, "They don't look like Indians to me. They don't even look like Indians to Indians." That brings that concept of how we look, how we sound, how we are perceived in terms of our cultural identity full circle into what rights we have and how we're able to utilize